Well, now let's discuss the Western powers' eagerness to act on Syria with Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the UK Independence Party and a member of the European Parliament. Mr. Farage, thank you so much for joining us here on RT. Well, as we know, the UK Parliament is being recalled to vote on a response to the alleged chemical attacks in Syria. But why now? I mean, why not wait until the UN investigators finish their job and, come up with some results of their fact-finding mission?
Well, from the very start, it's been the British government, particularly in the shape of William Hague and indeed David Cameron himself, who throughout the entire international community have been the keenest to get involved in Syria, whether it's arming the rebels or now, as we see today, a build-up of warplanes in Cyprus, preparations for cruise missile attacks. This government, the British government, has been the keenest of anybody to intervene in Syria. So that's why they're not prepared to wait. I think they also think that it's unlikely that they will get a resolution passed through the UN Security Council.
And what will happen then? I mean, some of the countries are saying that they do not need that mandate from the UN Security Council. Will they go ahead then with a military action without that?
Well, I mean, international law is something that, people ideally, I would have thought, before launching a military attack would want to have. And I'm sure that if we do go in for military action without UN Security Council approval, it'll be a row that goes on for decades. But ultimately, international law itself is not going to stop the British and the French and perhaps the Americans if they choose to do something.
Well, I mean, we're also hearing that Western powers from the Reuters news agency have told the Syrian opposition that they will strike within days. But does that mean that the decision has already been taken?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. I think the British government have made their minds up. That's why you've got the build-up in Cyprus today. Parliament's been recalled because I think that throughout the Conservative Party and indeed throughout very large sections of the media in Britain, the questions are being asked. Please, Prime Minister, can you tell us what are the aims and objectives of this mission? How can you guarantee that we won't become more deeply embroiled? And so I'm hoping that in 48 hours' time, when the British Parliament meets, we get some answers to those questions. But I have to say that ever since Tony Blair's time, starting off with Bosnia, we seem to go in for foreign wars with alarming regularity, often having no really clear objectives or any idea how we're going to withdraw. And just to prove that point, we've now been in Afghanistan for longer than the First and Second World Wars added up together.
Well, as we can see, Britain is ready to go ahead as well as some other Western countries. But where does the rest of Europe stand on this?
Split, I think is the honest truth. Split, but overall, I sense that the feeling of moral outrage that perhaps John Kerry expressed yesterday, the feeling of moral outrage, I think, will win, and therefore a majority in Europe will decide that military action is acceptable. I would just say this, number one, can we please actually find out for certain that it was Assad that used those weapons? It's probable that it was, but please can we find out for certain? And I would say to everybody else that moral outrage on its own is not a good enough reason to get involved in a war that could have unforeseen consequences. The real worry is that we have Iran and Russia on one side, we have Britain, France and America on the other side, and without wishing to sound like a doom-monger, military intervention in Syria could lead to something far bigger and far even more worrying than we're seeing at the moment. So I think we really have to think very carefully. My view is that what we've done in Afghanistan and Iraq, in fact, for many decades, whenever Britain's got involved in the Middle East, we tend to have made things worse, not better. And horrible though it is, ghastly though some of the crimes are that are being committed, there is nothing the British military can do, in my view, to make things better.
Well, Mr. Farage, just to clarify, at this point, there's no proof or any indication so far that it's, in fact, the Assad government that carried out the camel attack, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that I do myself believe it's probable that they did, but it's not absolutely certain. You know, this whole situation is very, very complicated, and the so-called opposition are very, very split amongst themselves, and there are, you know, probably as strong hatreds between some of the opposition groups as there are against the Assad regime. And I just think we ought to be slightly cautious, and we ought to absolutely make sure that it was Assad that used those weapons.
Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party, member of the European Parliament. Thank you so much for your views, sir.
Thank you.